before I go in for open heart. The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Dear John, Part 1, a reply to a confused Christian. Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm recording this in December of 2021, just a few days before I go in for open heart surgery. Because of that, I've decided to make December's videos a little bit different. And I hope this is a format that people find useful, because I get email, including email from believers, and they tend to have some typical bits of confusion at different times. And so I thought what I would do is I'm going to put up 4 relatively, hopefully shorter videos, like under 10 minutes, where I address all 4 parts of this one person's confused response. Some of it, as we're going to see as we start off here, has nothing to do with arguments for the existence of God. It's just absolute tone policing. But this individual became a patron, pledged $5, and then sent me a message immediately. And I read the message, I replied to the message, and I got a reply back. Part 1, this video, is going to be about his introduction to this letter and his tone policing. Part 2 is his accusation that I misunderstand the God of the gaps, or I've used it wrong, or there's a problem with God of the gaps, when he demonstrates repeatedly that he doesn't understand God of the gaps at all. Part 3 is in response to his claim that Adam and Eve have been scientifically proven, along with a lot of other factual misunderstandings, and the typical nonsense that we get from creationists about wagon wheels being found and what this means. And then the last one is going to be about his final response to me and kind of cleaning everything up. Hopefully you find this useful. Here's the first message that he sent to me. I've included it with only one edit, and that's because he mentioned someone else by name. But I figured I'd read this first part of this, and then we'd start working on replies. John writes, I'm a Christian that wanted to message you because I noticed some pretty big flaws you keep mentioning in your videos, and flaws in some of your arguments as well. Please do read this message instead of ignoring it, because how does someone know if they're correct if they're unwilling to hear how they might be wrong? That's a fair point. I can appreciate that people should listen, and maybe John's got something to teach us. Let's start off with arguably the most important example. Cool. I love he's going to talk about factual mistakes right off the bat. Let's get to this most important factual mistake. You sometimes insult religious people on the atheist experience, either when they call in or when you make a statement about them. And you should know that you really shouldn't be doing that, because according to YouTube's terms on hate speech, you insulting people over their religious beliefs is literally ban-worthy. Here's the terms if you want to go read them for yourself. He's actually completely wrong. First of all, hate speech can be about religion. If I'm making instructions about that you should mistreat someone or do something to them or whatever else, or hate them because of their religious views. Merely insulting people because they hold religious views that are absolute garbage, immoral, irrational, and harmful to the world is protected by free speech. And I let John know that he's absolutely wrong about the terms of service, and that he's free to go and report me if he'd like to. He says, continuing, I mentioned that because the atheist experience could be outright banned off of YouTube, and the hosts would be 100% at fault for it. So if you actually care about the show and the viewers, then you might want to stop with the constant insults. So we've gone from I sometimes insult people to I constantly insult people, according to him, and I need to stop that. But he continues and he says 2 other things, which is great, because he said he found factual errors, and he started with, hey, you insult people, and now he's going to move on to 2 other things, except that he doesn't. 2 other things would be how insults shouldn't be used at all, because they're usually a last resort when someone has no other argument they can use. And if you actually do care about trying to convert people, then insulting them or hanging up on them only after a few seconds of talking to a theist isn't the way to go about it. Even other atheists agree with what I mentioned above. This is where he included a link to someone who I have issues with, and then he concludes this first section by saying, I realize the insults are partly for show in order to try to make the show more interesting instead of you actually trying to insult them. But that doesn't change the fact that that still shouldn't happen. By the way, this is also one of the main reasons why more theists don't call in. That's that and what I mentioned below. Okay, so first of all, some notes here. He writes in to say that he found some pretty big flaws in videos and flaws in some of my arguments. Hopefully we'll get to them because that's not where we started. Where we started was with someone telling me, hey, you could be you are violating YouTube's terms of service and you could get the atheist experience shut down. This sort of tone policing threat is pretty common. And it comes from people who I think most of the time aren't actually watching like entire episodes. Instead, they'll watch a highlight clip. And this is one of the problems that I have, because if you watch the show honestly, and I'll be the first to say, have I insulted people? Yes, absolutely. Am I occasionally arrogant or condescending? You bet. Am I also occasionally patient? Yeah, very much so. I get email all the time about how patient I am. Other people think I'm impatient, and it depends on what portion of a call they saw. And this is part of the problem with the YouTube culture is that, oh, here's a highlight clip. And so when things get really heated and Matt's throwing down and they're throwing down and you're coming at it back and forth, that's what people see rather than, hey, I gave them 5 chances to present anything at all that looks remotely like an argument in construction, and they couldn't do it. This is someone who just believed whatever crap they got from Kent Hovind or that they heard from some apologist secondhand. But he wanted to start with that because he thinks it's the most important example of what's wrong with me is that sometimes I insult people. And when he goes on to 2 other things, it's really just the same thing. He's still just going on and on about me insulting people. And he wants to point to, he's like, even other atheists agree. And he points to someone I'm not going to talk about other than to say that this person does not do live call-in shows. And I don't care about what their opinion is for personal reasons. We've had a falling out. There are plenty of people, if anyone has a problem with the way I do something, they're free to come to me. And they do. Theists and atheists alike have come to me to say, hey, we think there's a better way. There's a different way. I had a bit of a falling out with someone who I've worked with on some things because they don't like the way that I do atheist experience. And my answer to them, ultimately, when we got down to it, was go do it however you think you should do it. I want as many voices as possible involved in this, or as many voices as can reasonably benefit. But I've never said that my way is absolutely the right way. I've never said that I'm perfect or that I don't do things wrong. I absolutely do things wrong. I just don't take up the time on the atheist experience to go and rehash anything that was done before. I hash them out here and on Twitter and Facebook and other things. He cites absolutely no examples, none, of me insulting people. So what he considers to be an insult that's gone too far, I have no idea because John didn't bother to say, here's something where you went too far. If he had, and I agreed with him, I'd be happy to say, yeah, I think that's an instance where I went too far, or no, that's not an instance where I think I went too far. Here's what you missed or what you overlooked. But if people aren't going to go, I mean, he wants to write me this letter to correct me on all the things I'm wrong about and really provides nothing of substance to even address. He just suggests that I do it sometimes, and then he changes that to I do it constantly and wants to label it hate speech. I've done Zen episodes where I've gone without any sort of name calling or raising my voice or arguing. I understand the idea that some people are going to look at this as, oh, well, if you lost the high ground when you said that was a stupid argument because it means you don't have a response. That's a bit dishonest because anybody who's presented arguments we've had a discussion about what it is, what the problems are with the argument and everything else. It's only when we start going round and round where I feel like they're wasting my time, my co-host's time, and the audience's time. And I don't think there's anything else that's productive to get out of this. Do I ever, well, hopefully ever, dip into the things that are probably problematic for some people? Frustrations happen, especially when people are making arguments as bad as the one that John's going to make about Adam and Eve and other things coming up in the other videos. But where he says, I realize the insults are partly for the show in order to try to make it more interesting and that I'm not actually trying to insult people. John, you couldn't possibly be more wrong. I don't do anything for show. I'm me on the show. You're calling in, you're talking to me. Now, is there a difference between a formal structured debate where I'm standing on a stage with an opponent and people have paid money or gone out of their way to come sit down and be there? Yeah. Structured debates are going to be different from a call-in show. That's just the way it is. But I'm not doing any of this for show. If I say something there, apart from, mistakes that I have to retract, I genuinely mean it. And if I say, wow, that's the stupidest thing I've heard all week, I mean it. And if you are insulted by it, I don't care. My job isn't to coddle people. And I'm happy to insult a caller or more accurately, I try to make sure that I'm insulting their arguments or addressing their arguments and not the people. I don't want to just say, oh, well, I'm tired of all the idiots that call, because that's not the truth. These are people who are often confused. They may say things that are idiotic or stupid, but they're not going to be wrong about everything, I hope, although we are living in a world where people are advocating for a flat earth. But the responses that you see on the Atheist Experience are just genuine responses to people expressing immoral and irrational positions and the horribly confused anti-science positions that they try to sell, some of the same ones that John's going to try to sell in the follow-up videos. And when he says that me insulting people is the reason more theists don't call in, how does he know? How does he know how many theists are calling in? How does he know that there would be more? How many more would there be? Did he poll them? And are they actually watching the entirety of these discussions, or are they just seeing clips? Because one of the things that John overlooks, which I've talked about many times, is that I'm not actively concerned about trying to convince in an argument for the existence of God or against it, the person that I'm on the phone with, because I already know that the person I'm on the phone with is incredibly unlikely to ever change their mind, at least not during a phone call. And certainly not on live TV. Although it has happened, it's rare. The person that I'm speaking to when I'm arguing for these things isn't the one I'm on the phone with, but the thousands or tens of thousands who are watching this clip who agree with the person I'm on the phone with. Because we already know that once someone has made a public profession of a position, they are less likely to retract it. In fact, they are more likely, in some cases, to double down, even in the face of strong evidence to the contrary of the position that they've advocated for. There's something about being the person who's put on stage in front of people where you're just going to stick with what you said, because it would be far more embarrassing. It shouldn't be, but it would be far more embarrassing to say, wow, you're right. I was wrong. I've been wrong this whole time. And I would love to see that. It's happened once in one debate that I did, which I'm not going to go into detail on. I've talked about it before, where after the opening argument, essentially my opponent agreed with me, and then we just spent the rest of the time discussing. I'd love to see that more often, where someone makes a compelling argument and the interlocutor says, you know what, that's good. I don't have a response to that. Maybe I haven't completely changed my mind, but I have to accept that. And it's something that should happen more often, especially as we watch people find their way out of religious belief. But he begins the whole thing with this, I found these factual errors, but first let me tell you about why you shouldn't insult people. Now, I'm going to go through the rest of his messages over the course of the next 3 videos for this month. I would love to hear back from you guys, whether you find the content of the following 3 videos useful, because I think you're going to run into people who also believe that Adam and Eve have been proven by science, or that they don't understand the God of the Gaps argument, or they've been so sucked into like creationist propaganda that they think I'm just sitting here spouting off without knowing, as if I didn't spend way more time researching this than the average person who's going to just write. So I'm going to knock these videos out. And over the next few weeks, 12 weeks actually, I'll be recovering from a quadruple bypass open heart surgery. I realize it's going to date this video, so ignore that part. But I need you to tell me if what's coming up in the following videos is something that you benefit from, something you'd like to see more of. Now, obviously, I can't guarantee that I'll be able to put out videos responding to every theist that presents a case that I think needs to be addressed, because I have no control over when people are going to email me or what they're going to say. A lot of the email that comes in really doesn't require much to address. But this is one where there was a lot to address. and I look forward to hitting the rest of it. On this one right here, though, this one where it's about insulting, claiming I'm engaged in hate speech or I'm going to get the AXP canceled, I'll review your feedback on this one and the other ones as I recover from surgery. But I'm not a fan of the tone policing that comes in, and it comes in from theists and from atheists. And there are plenty of people who absolutely love the way the show works, and they love the fact that it gets heated on occasion, or that I'm a take no shit kind of guy. And I'm not saying that they're wrong. I'm not saying that they're right. There are plenty of people with different temperaments who are going to be better or worse at some of these arguments at different times and in different ways. That's why you don't see me putting out videos saying atheist so-and-so is doing it wrong. They're just being too soft and, mamby-pamby, blah, blah, blah. You need to get in their face, because that's not really what happens. What happens on the show is that we welcome a caller. We ask them what they believe and why, or try to ask them that. Try to have a discussion, and when it turns out they're not listening, and the most common complaint is, I've asked a question, and they avoid it, and I ask it again, and they avoid it, and I ask it again, and they avoid it. I would bet money, I don't know how much money, but I would bet money that most of the time when you see me get excited, when you see me get frustrated, and when I dip into saying, this is a waste of time, or whatever insult that John thinks I'm engaged in, I'm going to bet that most of those instances come after repeatedly trying to have a decent conversation and finding out that the caller is not equipped to do that. That's something that you're going to be seeing, maybe even as you go visit family members over the holidays, that you're going to be engaged in arguments where your family members or whoever you're talking to or the people at work know next to nothing and think they know everything, because they've been indoctrinated in listening to one side of this, the pro-Jesus side, the pro-religion side, for the bulk of their lives, and they never question it, and they never think about it. They don't engage in doubt. They don't understand critical thinking. You've been watching content here and elsewhere, maybe on some of those other channels that do things differently and don't like the way I do it. And I want you to watch both of those channels, which is why I'm not going to go trash talking the people who trash talk me. So let me know what you think about the upcoming videos here addressing John's stuff. And I hope after surgery, I will be back and producing more content that you want to see and that helps us all try to have better conversations. But remember that better conversations don't mean that you're some paragon of Zen who never gets riled up, never calls an argument stupid, or never objects to, what someone is saying. These things matter. And when people are advocating for pseudoscience and irrational beliefs, and when they're voting on behalf of those beliefs to legislate away other people's rights, that's a big deal. So let's go work some more on this letter to John. Thanks for hanging out. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Dear John, Part 2, God of the Gaps and Genetics. So we're continuing on with our reply to John. In the first one, we basically just talked about his concerns about me spreading factually incorrect information, and mostly about tone trolling, or tone policing, and controlling my tone. This one actually gets into some things where he's going to lecture me about God of the Gaps and genetics. So I'm going to read this, and I'm going to interrupt it, and we'll put it up on the screen, take it back down. So if you don't get to finish reading it the first time, I realize you could pause, but I'll probably put it back up. But continuing his message from before, he said, another thing would be the flaws behind your God of the Gaps counter argument. You do realize everything technically counts as a gap argument, right? So I'm going to start with this right off the bat, John. First of all, God of the Gaps isn't a counter argument. Well, it can be formed as one. It's certainly not mine. And it's not any sort of, I think John's not really that well versed in what is an argument and what's not, because God of the Gaps is an objection to attempts by religious individuals to insert a God into gaps in our knowledge. It is an objection to a poor, fallacious sort of argument from ignorance fallacy, where you stick God in. It's not mine. As a matter of fact, even just a quick Google search will take you to the history of this, where Nietzsche mentioned it, And Henry Drummond, an evangelist from like the end of the 19th century, talked about Christians trying to fill a gap with a God. And his case, and the case of many others, was this is a big mistake. You're looking at a gap in our knowledge and saying God fills that gap as if God is the explanation for this. And those evangelists, those apologists, their position was that God is nature, that everything about nature is God. It's either God is the whole of nature without any gaps, or he's not there at all, is kind of what they were saying. And they were Christians objecting, not Nietzsche wasn't, but they were, Drummond and others were Christian evangelists who were objecting to bad arguments from their fellow Christians. It's like saying, hey, we've got evidence for God when somebody else views it as a tenet of faith that you don't need evidence, or that some specific facet of nature is an evidence for God when they claim that all of nature is an evidence for God. But when you say that you do realize that technically everything counts as a gap argument right there. What we're saying is, if someone says, why is the sky blue? What causes lightning? What causes disease? What caused it all? We don't know, and therefore we'll stick a God in as that explanation. That is the God of the gaps objection. And when John says that wants to know if I realize that everything technically counts as a gap argument, well, I think if I'm being charitable with what John's saying, yes, you're right, John, that if there's something we don't understand and we gain some discovery or some new piece of knowledge that explains it, then we've had a gap in our knowledge that we've then filled. The objection in God of the Gaps parlance isn't that you filled a gap, it's about what you filled a gap with. Because if I said, why is the sky blue? And you said, it's magic. Well, you've tried to fill a gap in our knowledge. I would argue that you haven't given us any knowledge. And I would argue that religions haven't given us any knowledge of these explanations either. They're just assertions that are without foundation. And that is the objection. So we have gaps in our knowledge and we're going to fill them. We filled gaps in our knowledge about humanity when we discovered DNA and the processes by which DNA changes, and that leads to understandings of evolution and everything. There are countless discoveries that we've made which fill gaps in our knowledge. The problem is when you fill those gaps with a supernatural agent devoid of strong evidence for its existence or any real tie to reality at all. John continues, and he says, what I mean is if you were to hold those same standards to history books in general, then you wouldn't believe a single thing in them. Imagine if I said, show me evidence of George Washington himself, instead of people claiming to have met him or evidence that would exist if he was alive, Washington, D.C. being built, but I want evidence of Washington himself and you can't show it, then there's no reason to believe he ever existed. If I said that, you'd say I'm being unreasonable, yet you don't think you're being unreasonable when holding those same standards about the Bible. So the thing is, John, I don't hold this. I hold standards of evidence that are, if you're going to tell me what happened, I want evidence for it. You can't provide evidence for God that is even remotely comparable to evidence for the existence of George Washington. I mean, he was the first president. We have things written in his own hand. We know about battles that he led and people that he met. I'm not discounting hearsay accounts. I have no problem with the notion that maybe there was someone named Jesus who existed. It's funny that you went directly to Jesus. Even at a minimum, there are people who would try to claim that Jesus was real and a part of their lives. That's not the part that's objectionable. The part is when you start ascribing magical trans-world agencies and powers and start claiming that there is in fact a God that exists outside of space and time, and that this God is the sustainer, creator, and governor of the universe and is responsible for everything. That's the objection. It would be, if you're going to make this George Washington analogy, it would be like if you said to me, George Washington was abducted by aliens, and that's what gave him the know-how to become a good general and eventually the first president. And when he was abducted by aliens, he learned something from them. And if you don't accept George Washington into your heart, the aliens are going to come back and kidnap you and take you away. That sort of thing. It's not about the existence of a human person. It's about asserting the existence of a superhuman being that exists outside of space and time and is the cause and everything for everything. That is where we would actually be at, John. But John continues and says, I'm sorry for being blunt, but you're being a hypocrite. The God of the Gaps counterargument is an argument that is largely only used because it always deflects God as the answer. Something I noticed during my years of research is people give a reply and then ignore the concern or question being asked because they assume they fixed the issue by giving a reply, but never seem to consider if their reply counts as a valid answer. And in many cases, their reply isn't a valid answer. People need to think their answers counter arguments through as well. This is probably the portion of John's message that confuses and concerns me the most, because I completely agree with it. People should be thinking through their answers, and that's the point. That's the very objection that the God of the Gaps counter argument that he wants to claim is making. It's saying, you didn't think through your answer. You didn't provide the evidence. I asked you, where did the universe come from? And you said God did it, and acted as if you gave an explanation for anything. God, the God hypothesis, has no explanatory power. When we're going to explain something, we explain it in terms of other things that we understand. God is an attempt to solve all of the world's greatest mysteries by appealing to an even bigger mystery. It is a grand exercise in irony that John does not understand that what he's describing here, I almost believe that this was a put-up job, that this was someone saying, what's the most ironic, confused email I could send? I could have them say, hey, you don't understand the God of the Gaps, and then argue for the exact problems with the God of the Gaps, the exact things that they're objecting to. But he continues then by basically countering everything that he just said, because he said it's not a gap argument either. Contrary to what many atheists claim, there's actual historical and scientific data supporting the Bible, which is one of the original things that led me to becoming a Christian. And here's his primary example. For example, humans have 3,230 genes that can't mutate, meaning we must have popped into existence pre-made at some point in the past. And he links to an article at science.org with 3,230 genes you can't do without. I don't mean to be mean, and I don't mean to be overly insulting, because that seems to irritate John to the point where he writes letters. But John's confusion here is complete. What he writes, and I want you all to kind of see this and think about it for just a second, is that he says that there are plenty of historical and scientific data supporting the Bible. But what he's getting ready to say has nothing to do with the Bible. Nothing at all to do with the Bible. Even if he was correct that there were 3,230 genes that do not and cannot mutate, that would not be support for the Bible. It might be consistent with something he's interpreted for the Bible, but it doesn't tell us anything at all about whether anything in the Bible is actually true, because the Bible doesn't talk about genes at all. But John has completely misunderstood. John's understanding of science and genetics is so corrupt and so confused that he took an article from science.org. The article is 3,230 genes you can't do without. And from that, evidently he didn't read it and didn't bother to go research it. He just said that because of that, this is evidence that there are 3,230 genes that, in his words, can't mutate. Well, John, I hate to tell you this. Actually, I don't hate to tell you this. That's probably dishonest to me. I love to tell you this. I'm sorry that you got it wrong. That article isn't saying that there are 3,230 genes that are incapable of mutating, which would be miraculous and would fly in the face of everything we've understood about genetics. It's saying here are the genes that specifically would make you not human or not continue to live if they were to change. All genes can mutate, John, all of them. And if you had read the article that you linked to, that science.org article, it has specific comments in there. It says if you fiddle just a bit with any one of the about 3,200 genes in the human body and you could be toast. That's because there are about 3,200 genes in the body total. The conclusion of a new study, which finds that about 15%, or sorry, there's 20,000 genes roughly total, but about 15% of the 20,000 genes are so critical to our livelihood that certain changes can kill us before we're born. The findings should help researchers better track down the genes that cause human disease. That is what that Science article says. It doesn't say there are 3,000 genes that are incapable of change. It says there are 3,000 genes that if you change them, you get horrible diseases. The basics of science, genes can change. In the process of copying DNA, mistakes can be made, errors can be introduced, and we can, in fact, manipulate them. There's no gene anywhere that is somehow immune to change. John thinks that he's found something purely miraculous because his ability to comprehend an article from science.org is absolutely mind-numbingly blocked. And it's blocked because he's bought into a bunch of misinformation from apologists, from creationists, people who want to poo-poo genetics and evolution. John has bought into all of that, and we're getting ready to see some of that in the next video, because after John tries to claim that there are genes that can't change, and therefore this somehow proves that we popped into existence fully formed as we are now, and he cites an article that literally talks about if these genes change, you will die, and at no point does any of these say that genes can't change. He's going to go on, and we'll talk about this in the next video and the one after that, to talk about Adam and Eve and wagon wheels and all the things that he finds as incredibly compelling evidence for God. And yet we still haven't got to a thing, not one thing, that he's pointed to that I'm factually incorrect about. We have, though, found something he's factually incorrect about, and that's genes. We've also found another thing he's factually incorrect about, and that's the nature of the God of the gaps fallacy with regard to theists stuffing their God in to try to explain things. As a reminder, I'm shooting these in December. This month's videos are very different. It's 4 videos that's all 4-part, responding to the same person who's confused, in the hopes that when you run into people over the holidays or at work or whatever else who make claims like this, these are the sorts of claims that are getting around, at least within pockets of Christendom, pockets of apologists, that you'll then know ahead of time, oh, the study that they're going to point to, that doesn't say that there's 3,200 genes that can't change. You got that wrong. You heard about that wrong. You read something that was wrong. I hope that this content is useful in your conversations as well. Please let me know in the comments. And once I'm back up after my heart surgery and recovery, we'll take a look at this. Obviously, as I said in the past one, I cannot guarantee that I'm going to get letters like this from people that are going to be just monumentally wrong. Who knows? I could get a letter from a Christian at some point that's completely right and converts me. And you better believe that that's a video we'll see. Until next time, take care. The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Dear John Part 3, Adam and Eve and Biblical Archaeology. Hey, welcome everybody. Hope you're doing well. I'm getting ready to bring this to a conclusion in the near future. I've got this video and one more to do. If you haven't watched the first 2 parts, they were just released as well. I'm recording these in December, just shortly before I go have open heart surgery, because John, a Christian who joined my Patreon project, pledging $5, sent me a concerned email. And I won't rehash what we've gone through in the last 2, but he thinks I'm factually incorrect on a number of things, and he wants to correct me on that and teach me. And so let's see what John has to say in this 3rd part. In the last one, we talked a little bit about the God of the gaps and then genetics, both of which John managed to get completely wrong, including the article that he sent debunked the position that he was holding to. But John says another thing would be how Adam and Eve are scientifically proven. Scientists were mapping the human genome in 1998 for the Human Genome Project that was being worked on, and noticed a discovery they refused to believe. The X chromosome for females had only around 6,000 years of mutations. swept it under the rug for the same reasons many atheists chose to ignore it. And because they assumed the theory of evolution was fact, they ignored the 6,000 years age and literally made up the 200,000 years age range because that's what fit with evolution. Don't take my word for it, though, because Wikipedia's article on this outright admits to what I mentioned. And then he links to the Wikipedia article. The Wikipedia article that doesn't actually say what he thinks it says. The Wikipedia article on mitochondrial Eve specifically states, in human genetics, the mitochondrial Eve, also MT-Eve or MT-MRCA, is the matrilineal most recent common ancestor of all living human beings. In other words, she is defined as the most recent woman from whom all living human descendants in an unbroken line purely through their mothers and through the mothers of those mothers, back until all lines converge on one woman. It's important to note something that John clearly doesn't understand. Most recent common ancestor is a moving target. It takes everybody who's alive and says, there's at least, there's one person here that we are all related to. It does not say first common ancestor. It does not say first ancestor. It does not say first woman. None of those concepts fit with mitochondrial Eve. It is a metaphor that is problematic because the scientists picked it out and basically said, oh, this is our most recent common ancestor, not our earliest common ancestor, not our first common ancestor, most recent. And so we'll just call her Eve, because they didn't really spend time to think about what religious zealots who don't understand science would try and do with it. Literally on that Wikipedia article, it says the name mitochondrial Eve alludes to the biblical Eve, which has led to repeated misrepresentations or misconceptions in journalistic accounts on the topic. Popular science presentations of the topics usually point out such possible misconceptions by emphasizing the fact that the position of MT-MRCA is neither fixed in time, as the position of MT-MRCA moves forward in time as mitochondrial DNA lineages become extinct, nor does it refer to a first woman, nor the only living female of her time, nor the first member of a new species. Literally in the article that John linked to us on mitochondrial Eve, it does not suggest that there was some conspiracy to change the date based on genetics there, or the number of mutations. And we don't know how many mutations could take place within a certain time period. So there's more flaws about genetics. But literally the thing that counters his assertion on mitochondrial Eve exists there on the page he linked. And this isn't the first time he's done this. If you watched the previous video where we talked about God of the Gaps in genetics, John misunderstood an article that he linked me. He literally sent me an article from a science magazine about 3,000 or so genes that if they changed, you would die, etc. And he misunderstood to think that these 3,000 genes could not change and that this miracle is consistent with God, and it's why, humans exist. So now here we are, and he's sending me to a Wikipedia article on mitochondrial Eve, as if I've never studied or learned about it at all in the past, despite the fact that I've talked about it on more than one occasion. He gets everything about mitochondrial Eve completely wrong, and the correction was right there in the email he sent. That link to that article includes the things that I just read. He says another source would be Googling mitochondrial Eve Gibbons 1998, as if that's not a linked reference to Wikipedia, so he doesn't know how Wikipedia works either. He says, we've also found many of the sites mentioned in the Bible, like the Tower of Babel is a place you can visit to this day. Sodom and Gomorrah were for a fact historical cities and have been found in ruins. So first of all, no, I'm sorry. He stopped sending links. I wish he would have sent a link to the Wikipedia article on the Tower of Babel, because if he'd done so, then he would have seen that right there in the article, it states that this is a mythic place. There is no Tower of Babel available for someone to go view. He didn't present a link either. I don't know. Maybe he couldn't find one. Maybe when he read it, he didn't like what he heard. But there is no place on earth that has been identified as a Tower of Babel that you can go visit. And his email says the exact opposite. He says in that third paragraph right there, we've also found many of the sites in the Bible, like the Tower of Babel, is a place you can actually visit to this day. That is simply not true at all. And he says Sodom and Gomorrah were for a fact historical cities. That is also not true. It has been supposed that perhaps they were historical cities, but they haven't been found. There aren't ruins. And even on the Wikipedia article I didn't have to do research on this part beyond going to Wikipedia articles that I think were linked from what he sent me, even though he didn't send these. It's been theorized that if the story does have a historical basis, the cities may have been destroyed by a natural disaster. There is no Sodom and Gomorrah that you can go visit. He continues in his email after getting it wrong about the Tower of Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, we found chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea that line up time-wise with the account of Moses described in the Bible. There's also evidence of Jews being enslaved in Egypt. There's also evidence of some type of historical economic disaster happening in Egypt as well, like what's described in the Bible. And then we also patron cut off the latter half of my message. I'm sorry, but I'm not repeating it. So clearly, whatever else he found wasn't important enough. My main point was basically, please be careful on what you say, because a lot of what you claim is in one way or another false, and your viewers deserve to know the truth. So please do better in the future, because you are currently misleading your viewers. A quick example would be how you keep mentioning the Bible supports slavery. I had mentioned the above before patron deleted it. Even though verses like Galatians 5:1 and Corinthians 7:23 exist, do better. I will say, John, that it's embarrassingly bad for you to try to come at me on slavery by citing things that don't actually discount slavery and ignoring all the things I've done and said about the subject the number of times that I've actually debated it. But about your chariots at the bottom of the Red Sea, that's simply not true. Just like there's not, as you claim there's evidence of the Jews being enslaved in Egypt. There is no archaeological, scholarly, verified evidence that's been found that confirms the crossing of the Red Sea ever took place. That's literally, I'm reading directly from the Wikipedia article on the crossing of the Red Sea. As a matter of fact, what you're talking about with those potential chariot discoveries in the Red Sea, that's part of Ron Wyatt, the grand colossal Christian archaeologist fraud, made a bunch of claims. He claimed to find Noah's Ark and these the chariot wheels under the Red Sea and all these other things. Ron Wyatt and Wyatt Archaeological Research, their findings were so questionable that even Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis called Wyatt's claims fraudulent. And this is coming from the organization that tried to build, at least halfway build, a copy of Noah's Ark, and who I've just learned is currently planning to build a Tower of Babel. Do you know why they're trying to build a Tower of Babel, John? Because it doesn't fucking exist. If it existed, as you claimed, John, then Ken Ham would have no need to build a copy of what he thinks the Tower of Babel was, because people could just go there and see it. The Bible, by the way, doesn't say that the tower was destroyed. This is a mythological, legendary account, and the purpose of the story is to explain why there are people with different languages. God got upset with them because they were cooperating and trying to build a better world, and that was too much for God, and so God confused their languages and scattered them. Doesn't say anything at all about destroying it. And so you seem to think, John, that there's a Tower of Babel you can go visit. There's not, although Ken Ham is trying to build you one. You seem to think that there's a Sodom and Gomorrah you can go visit. You can't, but I would bet that something along those lines is maybe on Ken Ham's list later down the road. John, like many people, is very confused about biblical archaeology and Adam and Eve and genetics, and it's because John has put his confidence in the Bible, in his understanding of the Bible, and in the countless apologists who lie, dissemble, and misrepresent the facts of reality in order to try to prop up that religion. Now, I want to say that even if there was a place that we could identify that was a Tower of Babel, even if there was a place we could identify as Sodom and Gomorrah, even if we had evidence that the Jews were enslaved in Israel and that there were potentially plagues there, and even if we had evidence of chariots at the bottom of the sea, while those things are consistent with some facts from the account, in the Bible, they don't in any way demonstrate the truth of the Bible. It doesn't in any way demonstrate that God rescued the ancient Israelites from slavery. It doesn't in any way can prove that they walked across dry land, or that he led them around as a pillar of fire, a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. All of these things could be stories about things that happened to real places that God exaggerated. The fact that we might have been able to find some of these archaeological bits of evidence for the stories doesn't tell us about which other parts of the story are true and are not true. It doesn't tell us that there is in fact a God. It's just like if archaeologists in the future dig up New York, that's not going to prove that Spider-Man is real, as a friend of mine, or a former friend of mine, used to say frequently. I'm sorry that John is so horribly confused about every single aspect of this. He gets mitochondrial Eve wrong, doesn't understand that that's a metaphorical thing that has been countered and explained many, many times. And John is telling me, writing into me to say that I'm factually wrong and that it's very important. Take a look at what he says here. In the last paragraph, my main point was basically, please be careful on what you say, because a lot of what you claim is in one way or another false. Well, John, please be careful with what you say, because a lot of what you say is absolutely false. In fact, throughout this entire email exchange, there's vanishingly few items that aren't false from John, right down to whether or not I was violating YouTube's terms of service. We've got one more video because there was a little bit of a back and forth with John, and then I want to summarize this up. But while I can't guarantee that I'll be getting emails from people that I'm going to be able to address like this, this is content that I hope you find beneficial, because you are likely to run across people at your Christmas gatherings or at your office parties or in your family and friends, or people are going to cross who are going to say things like, what about the chariot wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea? In which case you say that hasn't been confirmed. And even if it had been, it doesn't confirm that there's a God outside of space-time, or that the other things in the Bible are necessarily true. And if they say, what about the Tower of Babel? You can actually go there. Now you know that you can't, but you know that one apologist who tried to build a copy of Noah's Ark is trying to work to build that as well. It's amazing what dishonesty some people will go through, but I don't think John is necessarily dishonest. I have my concerns because he stopped posting links to things as his claims became more outlandish. But I can't say that John is a liar. I can't say that he's a fraud, but John is horribly confused and has been wrong at every single major turn in this conversation or in his email, and yet is emailing me to say that I need to do better. Well, here I am doing better than before, and doing better than John. I'll see you with part 4 of this. The Atheist Debates Patreon Project presents Dear John, Part 4, John's final message and conclusion. Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. I'm going to keep the summary on this brief, as this is part 4 of this, and I've never done anything like this before. If you haven't seen the first 3 parts, you're going to want to watch them first. I'm recording this in December, before Christmas, shortly before my open heart surgery. And John, a Christian, became a patron of my Atheist Debates Patreon project and wrote me to say that I was factually wrong about some stuff, and he didn't like my tone and was concerned and was just trying to help me out. In the first video in this series, I talked about it in general, and then we went into this, it was mostly about the tone in the first one, and then we went into the specifics of his claims. And here we are with the final. Now, I replied to John because I told him to keep his money. I appreciate the fact that he was willing to become a $5 patron in order to correct me, but I think that was mostly about making sure that I would see a message. And so I told him to keep his money and that I don't need guidance from him, and I'm not convinced he's necessarily trying to help me out. Plus, he's factually wrong about seemingly everything. And John wrote back with this reply, which I'm going to address, and then we're going to touch on the totality of this experience, I suppose. John wrote, I didn't mean to come across harshly, so I'm sorry if I did, and I never said I was going to report you. But do you not agree that people deserve to know what's true? You instantly blowing off anyone that rues correcting you, which I think was supposed to be dares correcting you, certainly isn't the way to go about it. Even you should realize that last line. In part, I don't want to nitpick too much, because it's been really easy to go through these messages, and I could have been incredibly harsh because there are just monumental grammar and spelling errors all over the place, in addition to the things that are conceptually confused. And I don't want to pick on someone for spelling or grammar, especially if they're getting concepts right. But when he says, do you not believe that people deserve to know what's true? I don't think you have any right to know the truth, other than you have a right to explore the world and discover truth on your own. But I do value truth. I value truth so much so that I've set about trying to find out the best way to find out whether or not my positions are true, whether or not the things that I believe and accept are true. And John, on the contrary, has demonstrated throughout this entire exchange that he does not have the tools necessary to currently. Either he does not care about what's true, which makes him kind of dishonest in these messages, or he just doesn't have the tools to figure out what's true, because the things that he got wrong are just embarrassingly bad. But as is typically the case, when they don't get the, oh, thank you for correcting me, I now agree with you kind of response, there's an accusation that I'm just shutting down anybody who disagrees with me. And he continues by saying, I thought I might have been wasting my time messaging you because you've made up your mind, which isn't true. I have a tentative position, as are all my positions. Like how there are gigantic pieces of oceanic crust floating around in Earth's molten core and have to have sunk down there quickly. Know that long ago, because if they were millions of years old, then they haven't melted away by now. Or the Carr hill-sized boulders in the fossil record that were moved by waves like half a mile high. Evidence apparently doesn't matter to you. I'm going to continue reading this in a second, but I want to make sure that I address this, because evidence does matter to me, John. And while definitely I'm fine with tectonic plate movement and the geology behind it, your estimation that it couldn't have happened over millions of years is contradicted by the science of geology that catalogs things in geologic timescales of millions, hundreds of millions, and billions of years. The Earth is about, we'll just go with roughly 3 to 4 billion years old or so. And we've also been able to date our solar system and stuff like that. When John says evidence apparently doesn't matter to me, it does matter. And what matters more is that the evidence that I'm looking at is the best quality and best vetted evidence, rather than believing an internet article that tells me there's a Tower of Babel that I can go visit when there's not. I want to actually go look and see and find out what's actually true. He continues by saying, if you are ever generously interested in religion, and I think he means genuinely interested in religion, and have questions, then feel free to ask, ? As for the videos, '(S), go ahead, show your viewers these messages, but the fact I tried to help you with some of your mistakes and your first thought is you just spouting nonsense, so I'm going to ignore it, says more than enough. Did you ever think that perhaps the reason why you're an atheist is because you ignore all the evidence that's presented? For the amount of times you've demanded theists to present evidence on the atheist experience, I guarantee those viewers would love to know you weren't genuine. At the very least, thank you for reading. Take care. Well, I imagine the viewers probably know that I am, in fact, genuine. And yeah, I picked on your genuine and apostrophe and all the other stuff, because after so many messages, it's embarrassingly bad that you get actually all the facts wrong. And you don't know how to write, which means maybe your reading comprehension problem is just a matter of education. But when you write an email to me to suggest that I've already made up my mind, that I don't care about evidence, and that you were just trying to correct me, when in reality what you did was you wrote to me to tone police and tone patrol me to say that, oh, you shouldn't do this, it's insulting, without giving any specifics. And that when you didn't get the response you wanted to, you immediately accused me of not being genuine. For the people who are watching this, and I don't know if John's going to watch this or not, there's a part of me that doesn't think that John's arguing in good faith. I don't think he's genuinely concerned about the Atheist Experience channel getting canceled, or that he's just trying to make sure that I present facts to people, because he doesn't seem to have any understanding of how to confirm what is true. At the beginning, he sent links that actively countered exactly what he was saying. He sent a link about genetics that did not hold the position that he did. Even in the very link that he sent, he couldn't be bothered to read it and understand it to know that it was saying the opposite of what he was saying. The same thing is true for his understanding of the God of the gaps objection. John was wrong at virtually every turn. He was wrong about God of the gaps. He was wrong about genetics. He was wrong about Adam and Eve and mitochondrial Eve. He was wrong about a Tower of Babel. He was wrong about Sodom and Gomorrah. He was wrong about chariot wheels. He was wrong about history, archaeology, everything. And yet he's so filled with confidence that he must become a patron and write into the godless heathen who he thinks doesn't care about the truth to say, here, look at all the things you're wrong about. When John is factually wrong about every one of them. This is what's happening in the world that we're in. People are being misinformed, and they're being misinformed on simple things that you could easily go out and verify. Now, maybe John's a fake. Maybe there's some atheist out there that decided, ooh, let me make an account and I'll give $5 and maybe I'll be a parody. But they didn't have any reason to think that I would read it or that I would respond to it or that I would make these videos. And so I don't necessarily know that there's a fake. And plus, John has already reached the conclusion that I'm not genuine. I don't get to make that or reach that conclusion about John based just on this evidence, because I know people who are absolutely genuine or seem to be genuine in their belief in Jesus Christ and the God of the Bible, and yet they are wrong about all of these things as well. I think Ray Comfort is sincere in his belief and his convictions, and he's monumentally wrong about evolution, but even he's not this wrong. I think Ken Ham is sincere, and that's probably what's led him to build the Ark Park, and now he's going to try and build a Tower of Babel. But even he's not this wrong. He's not still citing Ron Wyatt, and they pointed out that was fraudulent. John was wrong at virtually every turn. People are being misinformed regularly. And this is why I do what I do. This is why I do these videos. This is why I do the Atheist Experience, the Hang Up, all of these other programs. And it's why, and I don't normally make an appeal. You can go back through my videos. I don't think I've ever really made an appeal like this. It's why you should consider becoming a patron to support the work that goes on here. Because I will continue to put out content that addresses these things. Some of them are going to be very specific claims that are really easy to debunk. Some of them are going to be a little more complicated, where here's an argument that you need to tear down. I'm going to have, once I'm out of surgery, an update on the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm not going to address anybody by name, but somebody thought I left out the important horn too. And so we'll address that once I'm recovering. I'd like to implore you to potentially become a patron of this project if you feel that countering this sort of misinformation is critical. Because right now it's propping up dangerous doctrines, and that works to create an anti-science, anti-knowledge, pro-mythology electorate that, if there were aliens visiting Earth right now, would make us the laughingstock of the galaxy. John, despite his claim that I don't care about truth and I'm not swayed by evidence, and that maybe I'm just an atheist because I ignore all the evidence, I've spent hours producing 4 videos based on a couple of quick messages from someone I've never met at all. I hope John appreciates this, and I hope John thinks. Because from his very first message, he said, how does someone know if they're correct if they're unwilling to hear that they might be wrong? I'm absolutely willing to hear that I might be wrong, John, but you didn't provide any evidence for any of your claims. You provided a bunch of bald assertions and then links to things that actually countered your claims. I'm curious whether John honestly cares about the truth and cares about how he might go about finding the truth. Because he was just wrong about nearly everything, factually, obviously, and embarrassingly wrong. And that's something that's fixable. Because despite messing around about grammar problems or anything else, or the confusion and the conceptual errors, including gross conceptual errors about some of this stuff, I don't begin by presuming that John is some hopeless idiot who's never going to understand this stuff. My presumption is that John and other people who see this, who may share John's views, who may think there's a real Tower of Babel, who may be confused about how mitochondrial Eve doesn't say that there was an original Eve as in the Bible. I'm genuinely concerned, and I give them all the benefit of the doubt that people are teachable, that they can learn. And that if they care to do this stuff, if they care to seek out the truth, if they care to learn the value of critical thinking, if they care to learn how to explore to find out which information and which sources are considered reliable. I didn't have to reach out to sources beyond pretty much what John himself sent. This type of correction is something that's critical. And while there are philosophers out there and on both sides of the God debate, and some of them are brilliant, and some of them are actively working to present logical arguments for the existence of God, and some of them think they've succeeded. I'm not convinced. Most of the people who are sitting out there, who are in the pews on the weekends, most of the people who are going to call into the shows, most of the people who are sitting out there laughing that, oh, look at Matt. Oh my gosh, it's so obvious. He just anti-God. He just hates God. He won't accept evidence, and he doesn't even know about all this. John's not alone. He's not unique. He's not even that unusual. He is the market for Answers in Genesis and Living Waters Ministry. He is the market for internet apologists. He is the market for the Lee Strobels out there selling their book. He is the market for the McDowells out there who are presenting their evidence that demands a verdict when it really demands a refund. Helping people like John, okay, maybe I'll never reach John. Maybe everybody who watches this video will be like, well, I'll take that bit of nugget of information from Matt and I'll go share it in a completely different way because Matt's some asshole who just called people names. I got a lot to do and I appreciate it. And one last note of appreciation to the patrons here, because since I'm specifically asking people to do this, I'm going, at the time this is recording, this may limit the shelf life of this video, but I hope not. If it's already much later in the year, just ignore this part. But I'm going in for a quadruple or possibly quintuple bypass graft on my heart next week. I'm excited to get through it and move on. I hope that I don't, die on the table. But if I do, I will not be praying and I will not be caring if somebody else is praying for me. Whatever happens is going to be science-based medicine. And the outcome of that's going to be based on the skills of the people in that theater, that operating theater, working on me and my overall condition. I hope once all this is done and I'm done recovering, that we can come back and maybe we will have heard something new from John and maybe we will hear from other people. And if this is kind of content that you like, that you feel are going to find value from when you're having conversations with people at Christmas or at work or with apologists as you're just beginning your journey to go out and stand up for reason, rationality, critical thinking, skepticism, humanism, and being a godless heathen without being necessarily viewed by the world as if you're some kind of monster that doesn't care about truth, I will see you once I've recovered. Thanks. Bye-bye.